I'm Rita Kakati Shah, your host for The Uma Show. Welcome to your one-stop journey for feeling empowered. We are a platform for change. We build confidence. We are your voice. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma. Today, we are exploring diversity and stigma within communities, caste, and religion. And I'm so excited to be joined by our goddess of go-getting for today, Sonia Thomas, who is Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at Colby College in Maine. Hi, Sonia, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. So you've got such an interesting background, Sonia. You are a Malayali girl, born and bred in rural Montana in a Catholic household to parents who are from Kerala originally, who settled in the US via Germany. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's probably not the typical second generation in United States diaspora story. So yes, my parents come from Kerala, India, and they first migrated to Germany. My mother was part of what's called the Brown Angels, a group of Malayalis women who went to Germany in the 1960s to become nurses, to study to become nurses there. They were also, both my parents are from a Christian background. So Kerala, some people might know this, has a large population of Christians in comparison to the rest of India. Christians in India are only 2.3% of the population, but in the state of Kerala, they're about 18.4% of the population. So wow. My parents were from a community known as the St. Thomas Christians or the Syrian Christians. And my mother moved to Germany to study nursing because of church networks. A lot of priests were trying to bring young Christian women from Kerala to Germany, and they stayed with nuns. They stayed in convents and worked in Catholic hospitals. At the same time, my dad was, he had studied to be he was in the seminary school to study to be a priest. And then he decided that it wasn't for him and he was going to study to be a doctor. And likewise with church networks, he started studying to be a doctor in Germany. And very unlikely story for the time, my parents met in Germany and fell in love. And they got married, and then they moved to the United States. After that, they settled in the DC area first in Washington, DC, where my one of my sisters was born in Germany, and then two other sisters were born in DC. And then they moved to a really weird place. They moved to Eastern Montana, which is, I think when we think of Montana, we think of mountains and it's beautiful and, fishing. But I grew up in the prairie badlands. So if you think of cows, cowboys, kind of a desolate, more kind of desert type landscape, and very sparsely populated. So
I'm picturing movies right now,
Yeah, like if you think of any cowboy Western movie, like that kind of landscape is where I grew up. My younger brother and sister were also born in Montana, and I spent my formative years in Montana, and there wasn't very many Indians or South Asian community around. No Indian stores, no groceries to get. In fact, Kerala is known for coconuts. My mom back in the day used to get sweetened coconut and soak it overnight, so you could take the sweetness out of it and actually cook with it, because we couldn't get any coconuts for a long time.
That's amazing. Wow. Gosh, it's what a change in sort of lifestyles, I guess. Wow. That's amazing. And I think it's part of your upbringing and your journey that really led you to pursue academia, and specifically women's studies. I mean, you are an associate professor at Colby College, where you've actually done some groundbreaking research on caste and Christian communities and Indian priests as well. That's pretty amazing. And I would assume that's got a lot to do with the upbringing that you've just described, actually. Tell us a little bit about your research and about that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of us, like when we go into academia, some of our background influences how we think and how we study. I don't want to say like experience is everything about what you study, because I also like to believe that as a non-Black person, I can still talk about issues of anti-Blackness and still fight racism. As a heterosexual person, I can still fight homophobia and transphobia. You don't necessarily need to be there, but I think so much of our experience does shape how our research comes about as academics. And in Montana, we were often the only brown people around. My parents were really devout Catholics. And in my household, we said the rosary, a novena to Mother Perpetual Help. We sang Malayalam devotional songs. We read the Bible every night. Then, of course, I'm also a woman. Yeah, I've always been interested in issues of feminism. I've always been interested in issues of race, and I've always been interested in issues of religion.
So it's really a natural transition for you to do that and therefore study, and it became a passion, I guess. And not just that, you're also a published author. You wrote Privileged Minorities, Syrian Christianity, Gender and Minority Rights in Post-Colonial India. Now, everyone is talking about white privilege right now. What does it mean to be a privileged minority?
That's a good question, right? We think like minorities are subordinated and we need to listen to minority voices. Rarely do we think about issues of privilege within minority communities. So I mentioned that my parents are from the Syrian Christian background, or St. Thomas Christian. These Christians believe that St. Thomas, the apostle of Jesus, came to India in the year 52 and converted Brahmins to Christianity. So they're called Syrian because they practice their mass in the Syriac languages. And it's often used to distinguish them from what we call Latin Christians, which are Christians converted by Portuguese missionaries, especially St. Francis Xavier. And so St. Francis Xavier and many other missionaries converted, Western missionaries converted Muslims and Hindus from mostly the lower castes, so Dalit Bahujan communities. So to this day, there's a glaring caste difference between the Syrian Christians who are considered forward caste by the Kerala state, who don't receive reservations, who are predominantly landowners, who have a lot of class privilege, and Dalit Bahujan Christians and Muslims and Dalit Bahujan Hindus. Right. So to think about a community that is, yes, a minority, but then also not exactly subordinated. Another thing that I look at in my research is issues of race. So we don't talk a lot about issues of racism in India, in South Asia. We think that racism happens in the United States.
Right.
And we think that casteism happens in India. We rarely talk about casteism in the United States. Some of what I look at is issues of racism in India, because supposedly as Brahmins, the Syrian Christians have this kind of thing that they are not Dravidian, they are Aryan.
Yeah.
And as Aryans, supposedly they have Aryan features, lighter skin. And so all sorts of things about colorism, I want a fair-skinned bride or a fair-skinned groom, gets played into I want to marry within my own caste. I want someone with a status job. I want someone who is not a Dalit Bahujan laborer who does agricultural work. I want somebody who's a landowner. And that's tied to casteism. So a lot of what I look at in my book, Privileged Minorities, is looking at how the Syrian Christians organize politically as minorities, but also to further their own economic, caste, and racial issues. And so you can see a lot of ties between the Syrian Christians and dominant caste Hindus.
Yeah, you brought attention to that, actually, because I remember, I think when we'd actually first chatted as well, I mentioned that because when I was growing up in the UK, I went to, similar to you, grew up in rural Montana. I grew up in a very lily white neighborhood in the UK, in the suburbs. My dad was a doctor as well. And I was the only brown person in my class, in my school pretty much, until my brother came along 2 years later. So during the week, I was used to being the brownest person there. At weekends, my parents signed me up for Bharatanatyam, South Indian form of dance, which, went through my blood. I absolutely loved it. Then all of a sudden, I was now the fairest person in the room. So I was, during the week, the darkest, and at the weekend I was the fairest. So I felt racism on both sides. It wasn't just one because I was, looked different. I also was different from my fellow Dravidian sisters out there, because I happen to be coming from the Aryan side. So it was almost like something that you don't bring, you're right, you don't bring attention to. People don't talk about that. But these are lasting, I would say, scars or experiences that shape who we are, you know. And then, you know, you grow up and you talk about these issues and you discuss them and you think, wow, but you don't think about them. That imbibes you when you grow up. So I'm really, really just so pleased to hear you actually not just talk about it, research and write about it as well. It's, you know, kudos for that.
I'm so glad that you brought up the Northeast too, because like if we can see racist discrimination in India, there are certain places where you can really just see it happening, and the ways in which India has occupied the Northeast and the military presence of the Northeast and the otherness of Northeasterners. And then you add to that the idea that, well, they kind of look Chinese. They don't even look like...
Oh my, don't even get me started there. Like even growing up in the UK, in London, so cosmopolitan. When I became exposed in later life to other Indians, second generation Indians, there was that side of racism. You know, oh, you're from the Northeast. And then suddenly the whole conversation changes. All of these sort of traditional racist remarks come out, which were very, very hurtful. You know, even to this day, as an adult, and I'm exposed to other folks from other parts of India or whatnot, and I obviously live in New York in the US now, people make a comment that touches me to the core when people say that. And I'm all about, well, they're just not educated in that. And I just bring it up. Before I would just take it and just be quiet. It'd almost be numbing. Now I just bring it up. I'm like, hey, by the way, do you realize that comment? And they don't think it's racist. They think, oh, I'm just joking. That's not a joke. You're talking about somebody's core, their structure.
I would say too, like these are not you know, how the Northeast is otherized racially is not separate from the military occupation of the Northeast, right? And how Dravidians are otherized as dark is not separate from anti-Dalitness. And the other one that I would bring up is the Sindhi population of Pakistan and India, right? Like how they're otherized as Blackness is tied to anti-Blackness in South Asian communities that, you know, we take on a normal basis as if it's like inevitable. But then we have centuries of this. You know, South India has centuries upon centuries of slavery. So to just say like, we don't have it, we don't understand it, and then we see it operating with the Sindhi community, with Northeasterners, with Dalit Dravidians, like it's just so... I could give you evidence after evidence happening, right? And what does it mean for me and my family to belong to this privileged community that has, you know, the Syrian Christians were not only landowners, but were slave owners, right?
Absolutely. And that's actually a really good segue in the fact that you're writing your second book currently, which focuses specifically on race and settler colonialism. So that is, I guess, a big inspiration, what you've just spoken about. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. This is an odd thing that I started studying my own life. When I grew up in Montana, there were some Indians in our lives, but they were all Indian priests. North Dakota in the early 1980s started inviting missionary priests from India. And the vast majority of them came from this, you know, either Syro-Malabar or the Canaan Catholic faiths, right? So this upper caste Christian Catholic community. So, you know, it was the 1980s. It was pre-internet. They had nowhere to go. They were writing letters home or like long distance calls. And they found a place in my parents' home. And so they would come and speak Malayalam and eat Kerala food. And so I had a very odd view that lots of people must be Catholic and lots of people must be Christian. I was kind of a rude awakening when I went to college in Minneapolis, and I did not know what Bollywood was, and I did not know anything about Hinduism. So it was really strange. But there were these priests that were around, first in North Dakota, and then in the mid 90s, Montana started to get Indian priests. And so how this research project came about was I was finishing my book, and I thought, like, I saw some pictures of a family friend, a priest who had taken two priests who had taken about 80 parishioners from Montana to India. And these are like white cowboys in cowboy hats visiting like a St. Thomas shrine outside of Chennai. And I thought, what is, like, if you're going to go to India, you're not even going to go to the Taj Mahal. Like, this is a kind of odd, like, trip. So I thought maybe I'll go back and I'll interview some people who went on this trip. And so I went back and I was interviewing some priests, mostly family friends that we knew. And I was talking to the diocese. I talked to the Great Falls Billings Diocese, talked to some people who went on the trip, and really clearly I was like, there's so much more here. It really made me think about issues of religion and spirituality different. And there's racism that a lot of the priests experience, which is not unlike my own experiences in Montana or my parents. But also a lot of these priests, some of the priests go to Native American reservations. And the Catholic Church has a long history, as do many other Christian denominations, of settler colonialism and cultural, if not, actual genocidal practices against Native peoples. Yeah, so that's my new research project, and it's shaping up to be a second book project that I've been working on.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So thanks so much for sharing about that. And if that isn't amazing enough, you're also a talented tap dancer. You've actually written articles on the Black vernacular traditions of tap dance in the US and around the world. Tell us a bit about how you got into tap dancing.
This is funny. You mentioned Bharatanatyam. You know, my mom always wanted to send us to Bharatanatyam dance.
Yeah.
Guess what? There's no Bharatanatyam teachers in Eastern Montana. They're not there. So you tend to be.
But there was a tap school, so.
Yeah, so she sent me to ballet. She sent me and my younger brother and sister, especially, to ballet and tap. I'm no good at ballet. I was not good at ballet, but I did take a liking to tap. I can't say enough about this form of dance. It is both music and it's dance.
Yeah.
And embedded in this form of dance is all of what we consider American culture. Because if we can think like that which we consider American culture truly American starts with the minstrel show and how much like the Black arts, the banjo, which is a West African instrument, percussive dance in the body, even jokes, and kind of tap dancers have this thing where they work off of other people's. It's a very social dance. So much of American culture, when we think of comedy, sketch comedy, I watch Saturday Night Live and I'm like, I can see elements of the minstrel show in something like Saturday Night Live.
You know what? It's funny you say that because there's so many similarities I find as the years go by between Eastern and Western dances. So when you mention the dancers, they kind of feed off each other. There's like an energy that happens in Eastern music and dance as well. In Bharatanatyam, we'd be doing a recital or something, and then the doublist would just do something different, and then it'd be almost like a competition, and then the Carnatic singer, she would sing some different raga or something, and then we would just dance and think of our own rhythm, and we just match that on both sides, and it became like a game. It was always back and forth, and it sounded a bit like that. There was just so many similarities that actually bonds everybody together that people don't even realize. And I think dance is one of those forms. What you've described with tap dancing and the rhythm and the percussion is actually very similar to Bharatanatyam. So actually, bless your mum for looking for something similar, because in a way she found something where you could exercise rhythm and the beat and something deep and meaningful as well.
Yeah, and I think there's some tap dancers that have collaborated with Kathak dancers.
That's right,
because of this, yeah.
And flamenco as well. That's another in between, isn't it? Where it's very much done with your feet and on rhythm as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always tell my students when I teach them tap now, I'm like, we're born to hear the swing in our bodies. I don't even have to teach students to do the swing beat. I can teach them a straight beat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I turn the jazz music on, and suddenly they're going, and 1, and 2, and 3, and swinging it.
They feel it and it naturally comes. Wow, yeah.
It's in our bodies, right? Like, so I don't know. I just, it really, I loved it. When I went to college, I was exposed to what are called master classes. So especially for the Black vernacular dances, they don't have, it's usually not taught in colleges and universities because racism.
Yeah.
Things that come from the Black community are not considered very scholarly. So you'll have classical music, but you won't have hip hop. You'll have ballet, but you won't have tap. right? Like, so I took classes from master classes outside the college. And then, you know, when I started doing my PhD work, Rutgers University didn't have a tap dance program within the dance department. So I started teaching it. I was just like, you can't
let me create one, isn't that? Yeah. It was funny, in the small town I was growing up, Hornchurch, in the northeast of London, they didn't have that much. But when I was, 3 or 4 years old, I did go to ballet, tap and jazz. So they did have tap dancing as well. Same to your point. So that was one thing my mum signed me up for. And I loved it. Just the, you know, I think somewhere she's kept my little tap dance shoes for when I was back in the day. So,
I love
that. So but yeah, the memories of it all. I love it. So I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit now. There's a lot of passion in everything that you've talked about. But, you know, this is life, and life hasn't been all roses and chocolates, so to speak, for you, has it? I mean, you have a 10-year-old daughter. You've been a single mother, actually, pretty much since the day she was born. Tell us about that life and how you managed everything.
I'll give you a great example, which is academia. Academia is run on a model that everyone is a white male and they have a stay-at-home wife taking care of the kids to this day, right? Like, so to professionalize yourself as an academic, you go to conferences. I was talking to my friend who's in the corporate world, and she said, they don't pay you to go to conferences? I'm like, no, we pay to go to conferences.
Wow.
We pay out of pocket to go to conferences. But when you're there, you go to panels all day long, you present your own work. And then afterwards, like many kind of probably corporate conferences, you go out for drinks and dinner and lots of networking, right? So the answer always about childcare at conferences is, you know, we can get an entity to take care of your kid. But the assumption always is too, like, it's just for when you present. And so many people who go to conferences that have children have a partner with them, and their partner watches their kid when they go out to dinner. But what do single parents do? Either I was an adjunct during part of my life, which means I was paid only by the class. I didn't have a stable job in academia. And my daughter at the time was 8 months old, and I was trying to get a job in academia, and I brought her to a conference, and, you know, I just held on to her. I was breastfeeding her while I was presenting. And, you know, one of the good things is I'm in women's studies. So most people are like, kudos. You know, like, so that I guess is good. But, you know, afterwards, some powerful feminists, you know, big name feminists were like, we're going to the bar. You want to come? And I said, yeah, like, I kind of feel like I have to. And so I'm like holding this baby in a bar, and I'm like, I shouldn't be here. I'm not doing my work good. I'm not being a good mother. And I think that's often, I think as a single parent, I feel like that immense amount of guilt. I want to be really great at my job. I want to be a great mother, and I'm scared that I'm neither, right? Like, and I put a lot of judgment on myself. But then when we talk about like how to make this better for parents, we'll say like childcare. We won't say, what does it mean if we could have networks available to have 24-hour plus childcare? Because in some ways I would rather leave her with somebody here and go to the conference to be able to do that networking and further my career. But it has to be somebody I trust. Right. So would an entity or an institution like my college, like, say, we'll defray some of those costs? Or we recognize that, and we won't make that, you know, such a thing for tenure as we are making it for other people. And we haven't gotten to a point in society where we recognize that at all.
Completely hear you there. You know, it's when you said that example, so about a year and a half ago, I was going to a conference. I was presenting at UNESCO in Paris, and I had 2 kids, and my son was in school full day, so he was sorted. My daughter was off that week, and my husband was working solid, and we didn't have childcare at the time. And I remember, you know, going to Paris, and then I just took Rhea with me. She came along. It was a very last minute decision, And she came on that flight, red-eye flight, because it was my, my work flight. So she came on the red-eye, but she functioned. She at the time was just kind of on the cusp of turning 4 at the time. So she was very young still, but she came to my conferences. I just sat her on the table and just gave her like pencils to write with that was there. And there was nothing, there was no snacks, there was no toys. It was my work case. I don't check luggage in when I travel for work, so she had to fit her luggage, her bag, her things inside my bag. It was my pack thing. I said, okay, we're gonna pack 2 outfit changes, that's it, and a couple of diapers, and that's it, so for overnight, and that was it. And she ran with it. And to your point, it wasn't just the working day, it was panel discussions after that, it was going out for drinks, it was for dinner afterwards. She came to all of it, and she was a champ. And there were a couple of times where, she just cried, but so be it. She's a child. And I wanted people to see that when I was speaking, when I was up on stage giving my keynote, I spoke about her. She stood next to me. I'm talking about changing perceptions and the next generations. She is the next generation. This is the reality of what I'm talking about in terms of stereotypes. And, to your point, it was, again, a very women-focused conference. So everyone supported it. But it's very different, the reality of it. Having her there was everything. So I completely understand what you're saying about, you just feel very alone, but you rely on that support network as well. You have to have that. Otherwise, you kind of feel like you crumble, right?
And I always am amazed how much I rely on other single parents, because single parents get single parents.
They understand.
Very aware that when we think about childcare too, to your point, like I brought her a lot when she was young. And now that she's older, it's harder actually, because I have to pull her from school. Right. Which, and if I'm going to pull her from school, she's going to get an educational experience to wherever we go, which means I need to tack on an extra day. It's just me and her and visiting museums and stuff to wherever we go. Last fall, before COVID, I was at University of Texas, Austin, and I asked them, like, can I stay an extra day in the hotel just so I can do that? Which then makes it's out of pocket on a single income, right? Like, so we've got to get better at talking about this, and not just in feminist spaces, cyberspace.
That's so true. And actually, that comes on to my next point, because in South Asian communities, rather than support, there is so much stigma against being a single mother and a divorcee on top of that. Quite often, rather than are you okay as being a question, you get asked all the time is, what would people say? That is the first thing that comes to people's minds. I found it astounding. I mean, what is your response, I guess, or reaction to those sort of comments?
Yeah, I wish I could say I had a great one, but I don't. I myself feel like I did something wrong. I myself put this stigma on myself. I think maybe I always say I'm my harshest critic. And so I feel I study women and gender in society, and I know that I live in a patriarchal world, and I know what the judgments are. This kind of feeling, especially in South Asian communities, that you've made a mistake and couldn't handle it. You didn't do something right. You're a failed woman with a failed marriage. So I don't know what the response should be. Sometimes I'm embarrassed by my own response. Like, for instance, when I do research, when I go back to India, I was just in India in last December, before COVID hit. I wear the Syrian Christian min, the thali, because I don't want people to ask. And I feel like I'm lying because I'm not married anymore, right? So, but rather than deal with it, I'll lie. And then I have this immense sort of guilt. Sometimes I tell people the truth because my reason for divorce is probably one that people feel sympathetic to. My ex-husband was an alcoholic and also abused prescription pills and became increasingly abusive. And so if I say he might have killed me if I didn't leave, people feel, okay, maybe that's an okay reason to leave. So sometimes I'm snarky about it.
You're spending your life now really trying to, I guess, fight against this stigma of, you know, mental health, domestic violence, addiction and divorce in the South Asian community because of this. This is something so deeply personal to you. If you were to leave a message for our viewers today, what would you say?
To the audience, if I could say anything, like, be kinder about these kinds of conversations and less judgmental, but have the conversations too.
Because you need to have the conversations, absolutely, because if you don't, you're not bringing awareness to it, and that's what you need for people to understand and to make change happen ultimately. On that note, I just want to say thank you for those ending words that said, you know, just be kind to people and think and have that empathy. And I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you again, Sonia, for sharing your life's work with us today. Everybody, Sonia Thomas, Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at Colby College in Maine. And thank you to our viewers for watching and joining on this empowerment journey today. We want you all to embrace that inner goddess of go-getting. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma.